Hi, Sharda ji. Good afternoon.
Hello, Geetanjali ji. Lovely to see you, even if virtually.
Yes, I know, finally. So, of course, a big warm welcome. I'm just going to let Archana give me the cue so I can welcome you and everybody accordingly. It's really nice to have you. So nice to see you after so long.
Yes, indeed. No doubt about
And
that.
Sharda ji, we are ready to begin.
Yeah,
Okay, thanks, Archana. Thank you. Should I begin, Archana? Yes.
Yes, please begin.
Okay.
So, a very good evening and a warm welcome to each and every one of the attendees of this webinar. September, as we all know, is the Literacy Month. Today, September 8th, is World Literacy Day. And SGMF, which is actively involved in promoting art, culture, and heritage, chose to commemorate this significant day by bringing on board one of the top academicians in our country. Thank you all for joining us for this interesting evening on art and science of metallurgy and metal artifacts by our distinguished speaker. I also want to warmly welcome all the guests here on the webinar and the ones watching on Facebook. Professor Sharda Srinivasan, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you. It is an honor to have you with us. We are grateful to you for taking the time out and sharing your knowledge on the subject. A distinguished academician, Professor Sharda's list of achievements and awards are numerous. She was conferred the Padma Shri in 2019 by the Indian government in a field of archaeology. A professor at the National Institute of Advanced Sciences Studies, she has recently been elected to the prestigious American Academy of Arts and Science as an international honorary member in the field of social and behavioral sciences. For us at SGMF, it couldn't be a better fit than to have Professor Sharda speak about archaeology and art. She has made pioneering contributions in this field from the perspective of exploring engineering applications in these disciplines. Not only is she an authority in her field of interest, but she is also an accomplished exponent of Bharatanatyam and has given numerous lecture demonstrations on artistic and scientific perspectives on the Chola Nataraj bronze at international museums and other venues. At SGMF, we constantly strive to bring on board illustrious speakers such as Professor Sharda through our various platforms, be it our live events, webinars, or then our podcasts. The ones who have not already been accustomed to the Expert Hour, our podcast series, it is freely available on all streaming platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google, where we focus on art, history, heritage, and culture. In keeping with the Foundation's ideals, we regularly bring knowledgeable talks, sessions, and distinguished speakers such as the one today, who are an authority in their area of interest. I would like to welcome you all once again and a big warm welcome to especially Sharda Srinivasan. A quick housekeeping rule. There is a question and answer.
Geeta, I think we lost you for a second, but just to continue from where Mrs. Maini left off, for those of you who are watching today, please note the Q&A box at the bottom of the toolbar. You may please type in your questions there, and we will take it to the speaker once her talk is over. It will be a moderated session. We will also launch a poll somewhere midway through the session, so do keep an eye out for that, and please feel free to answer the poll question. Over to you, Geeta. Once again, I think we just lost you for a second there.
Okay. So thank you once again, everybody. And Dr. Sharda, Professor Sharda, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geetanjali ji, for this very kind invitation to speak for the Sandeep and Geetanjali Maini Foundation. And I congratulate you on your very dynamic activities in the field of art, culture, and heritage, and especially through these pandemic times. And of course, thank you also for the very kind introduction. And I've had also the privilege of knowing of all your diverse activities in various fields related to culture, and it's indeed a privilege to be on this platform today. And so today I'm going to talk about the art and science of metals and metal artifacts. And thank you for mentioning, of course, that it is International Literacy Day. And I've tried also in my presentation to highlight the importance of the insights gained from looking at metal artifacts in terms of the inscriptions, the contributions from literary sources, and so on, and the way the metal artifacts also play a significant role in this understanding of the overall knowledge and knowledge systems of our cultural heritage and so on. So I will now proceed to share my screen. And let's just try and put it onto full screen. So are you seeing that as a full screen?
Yes, we can see it as a full screen, ma'am. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. So as I was mentioning, perhaps what I would really try to highlight in this talk is the way in which my own work as an archaeometallurgist, looking at the ways in which the analysis of metal artifacts can help to throw more light into the questions of the styles and provenance of artifacts, also form a supplement to the kind of information that we can get from inscribed sources. And for example, you're looking here at a fine example of a Pallava seal from the Government Museum, Chennai, which has an inscription and the bull emblem of the Pallavas. And you also, it's interesting to note how the bronzes themselves, the South Indian bronzes, the masterpieces of statuary bronzes going back to the Chola period and so on, also reflect some of the traditions of devotional poetry and the literary knowledge systems of the time and so on. And you can see here this beautiful bronze of the Tamil 9th century Shaiva saint holding the palm leaf manuscripts in his hands, which are bent in this fashion. And these were, of course, the great sources also of the repositories of writing and knowledge and so on. And what is also significant in terms of our cultural heritage is that the literary sphere of knowledge, learning, and so on was not just a male bastion, that there was a great place for the feminine. And of course, though that may not, that's also important for us to remind ourselves in this day and time where female literacy is also a very pressing concern, especially in some parts of Northern India and so on, to remind ourselves that there was a place accorded for the feminine as well in terms of literacy. And here you have a very spectacular image of the goddess Saraswati from the Brihadishwara temple. And the scribe is also celebrated in art. As you see, this is a beautiful example of the Jalasangvi from Karnataka, where she's actually shown writing in Hale Kannada and so on. And in the Jain tradition also, there is the prevalence of the goddess Ambika, and this is a fine inscribed image. You can see here the pedestal inscription, and this image is also of the 10th century. And I had also undertaken an exercise of technical fingerprinting, which I will touch upon later. But as you can see, the image is also seen holding the palm leaf manuscript. And on this particular image, the Chola Devi in the Freer Gallery, it has been speculated by some scholars, including Ananda Kumaraswamy, the celebrated art historian, that this might have represented an image of the great widowed Chola queen Sembian Mahadevi, who was a great patroness of art and temples and so on. And of course, we can't be sure that this is an image of Sembian Mahadevi because this is more a conjecture, but certainly she was a very remarkable queen after whom there is a town still named in Tamil Nadu. And She also had a great sense of history because she set about copying inscriptions which were there in earlier temples, which she renovated, such as Aduturai and so on. And there is also a commemorative plaque at the Uma Maheshwara temple built by her in the memory of her late husband, Gandharaditya Chola, at Koneri Rajapuram. And she's also seen, this might well be her seated as well as Gandharaditya along, shown worshipping the lingam and so on. So this is to point to the significance. And also it's interesting that these Chola Devis and goddess depictions usually have the sacred thread on them, which we in these times correlate mainly with Brahminical male traditions and so on. So this is to remind ourselves that there was also a place there for the feminine in terms of knowledge and to forge ahead in those aspects. As mentioned by Gitanjali ji, of course, the great aspect of my studies have been the celebrated Chola bronzes of the early medieval period. And this is a celebrated image of Nataraja as a Hindu god Shiva, as a lord of dance from Kankodu Vanitavam. And I had undertaken some investigations which showed that this was of leaded bronze with 8% tin and 8% lead. And of course, the Nataraja bronze was brought to the international stage also through the writings of Ananda Kumaraswamy, who wrote that this image represented the Panchakritya, or the 5 activities of Shiva, balancing creation with the drum, and Samhara represented by the fire. Creation, of course, is Srishti, and the icon is shown dancing on top of Muyalagan, or Apasmara, associated with ignorance. And in fact, this is the bronze in the Government Museum, Chennai, that Kumaraswamy wrote very elegantly about, describing it as poetry, but nonetheless science. And that image also captured the imagination of French master sculptor Auguste Rodin, who is also known for such sculptures as the Age of Bronze, which you see here. And he was inscribed to describe the Nataraja bronze as something divinely ordered. And this particular posture of the Shiva Nataraja is described as the Ananda Tandava, which is also carried over in surviving dance traditions, with the leg extended in what is termed as Bhujanga Trasita Karana. And the Ananda Tandava also represents the dance of furious bliss, as some have translated it, balancing creation and destruction. Well, the making of metal icons is practiced as an age-old tradition in parts of Tanjavur district, such as Swami Malai, where typically the wax model is first made, and then it is covered with numerous layers of clay, which were traditionally from the banks of the Kaveri River, to form the mold. And then the wax was melted out, and the molten metal was heated and poured in, and then the mold was broken open and the icon retrieved, and the fire skin is removed and it is finished, and so on. And this is seen in the workshop of Radha Krishna and Devasena Sthapati, which I've been following going back to 1990, in fact. And it is also interesting, of course, that in the modeling of the wax model, the use of the palm frond or the aureole is made. And of course, again, this is the palm frond, which is also very crucial to the manuscript tradition and such like. And the lost wax process is also mentioned in the Shilpa Shastras, or artistic treatises, as Madhu Chehiste Vidhana. And there is a lovely metaphorical reference to the casting process in the Tamil poetry of Andal, the mystic woman saint of the 9th century. In the Nachiyar Tirumori, she likens the downpour of rain from the clouds to the metaphor of the release of wax from the mold. As you can see here, the mold is heated and the wax model is melted out. It had been covered by these cow dung cakes. So you can see where that metaphor of the clouds and the rain and so on comes from. And it shows her keen sense of observation and as well as use of the metaphor. And this is used to evoke her devotion to Vishnu and so on. And she says, Ulle ulla melugu urukki vengala mutra. This was a translation also mentioned by Vijaya Ramaswamy, late Vijaya Ramaswamy. Well, the Chola Brihadishvara temple, built by Rajaraja Cholan, consecrated in 1010 CE in Tanjavur, had about 60 metal icons according to inscription. And now only 2 of them are actually seen extant in the temple of Shiva Nataraja and Shivakami. And these are also taken out during certain festivals. And there is a mural in the inner ambulatory of the Brihadishwara temple, which shows Shiva dancing in the golden hall of Chidambaram with the dancing goddess Kali, and the woman poet saint Karaikalamaya are also looking on. And of course, Adavalan or Nataraja as the dancer was the Kula Devata or the family deities of the Cholas. And the images were cast as processional icons or Utsava Murtis to be taken out in procession. And in fact, the queens, the Nampiratiyar and the temple dancers, the Nachiyar and so on, also made a lot of donations of lamps and bronzes as indicated by the inscriptions. Now, there are some problems with dating bronzes because of the fact that there are many continuing traditions and there are few inscribed bronzes. And many a time the bronzes are dated with respect to sculpture, which is having some datable inscriptions and so on. And although there are some Buddhist bronzes and also Jain bronzes, which are having some donor inscriptions, Hindu bronzes of at least of the South Indian affiliations are rarely inscribed. And this is one of the few examples of an inscribed Chola bronze, where there is a pedestal inscription which mentions that it was made in the time of Parantaka Cholan, an early Chola bronze, and it is from Karaiviram. And to give an example of the problems in the dating, stylistic dating of bronzes, this is a group of Somaskanda, which is Shiva and Parvati with the child Skanda. And in George Michel's book in 1995, it has been pointed out that it is one of the few bronzes which had a pedestal inscription suggesting that it was commissioned for the Ekambareshwara temple in Kanchipuram. And this suggests that in the Vijayanagara period also, there was a harking back to the classic Chola style, which is also one of the aspects that, as you can see here, the inspiration for the bronze is the Chola Somaskanda. And in this case, this image is of Parvati, seated Parvati, which I had fingerprinted to the Chola period with 12% tin and 8% bronze. And of course, I know we have a later talk by Dr. Vasundhara Filiosa where she clarifies that the Vijayanagara period should also be described as Karnataka Samrajya and so on. But for the ease of this particular study, I will restrict myself to the popular nomenclature of Vijayanagara bronzes. So what I had tried to do was to see how the chemical analysis and metallurgical studies of the bronzes can help to better classify them by looking not only at the major minor elements, but also the trace elements. And representative bronzes from the Victor and Albert Museum, Government Museum Chennai and British Museum were studied as part of my doctoral research at the Institute of Archaeology in London and continuing thereafter as well. And by analyzing for about 18 elements, the bronzes were grouped into different the stylistic periods, including Pallava, which is about 600 to 800 CE, and Chola, which is about the 10th to 12th century, and then Vijayanagara, 14th to 16th century, and so on. And in doing these studies, I also included some dated seals and inscribed bronzes to the extent that I could. And of course, although the major elements tend to be randomly alloyed, such as lead, tin, or zinc, and so on, the trace elements can show some trends because they can be related to the copper source. And so the analysis of trace elements becomes meaningful also in the clustering. Of course, the South Indian images are often described as Panchaloha or 5-metalled icons, but this is symbolic rather than literal because many of them are just leaded bronzes or leaded brasses. So it's not really in that sense alloys of 5 metals. And sometimes it's misleadingly thought that they have a lot of gold and silver in them, and sometimes images are damaged. But as you can see, the major elements are basically leaded bronze or leaded brass, and as indicated also in this microstructure. Now, another technique that I had used in combination with the compositional and trace element analysis was lead isotope analysis, because that tends to be more sensitive because the isotopic composition of an artifact is not changed from the ore source to the metal. And lead has a particular property that different ore sources or lead deposits have distinctive isotopic ratios because of the fact that they are related to the geological origin of the ore deposit and uranium and thorium and so on. And so if we have the lead isotope ratios of a leaded artifact, it is possible to identify that to the source of the lead if we know the lead isotope ratios of particular ore sources. And sometimes that data is not always available of all the ore sources around the world, but it can help to some extent when the data is available. And for example, this is an interesting case of the giant image of Santinatha, which is from the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it had an inscription of 1236 CE. And it's a very fine image, about 1 meter, as you can see, with inlays and things like that. And this image actually fitted very well the lead isotope ratios of the Ambaji mine in Gujarat. And it is also dated to the Solanki period, so this is a good match. And this image, interestingly, had about 24% zinc. It's a brass image. And I also found that there was a Buddha image from Kanchipuram, which also had 21% zinc in it. And this also matched the lead isotope ratios of the Ambaji mine, suggesting that this was a source of lead and brass and so on in the medieval period. And of course, we know that the Solanki period is also famous for the Rani Ki Vav, which also shows their skill in excavation, in this case, the skills in the excavation of a step well and so on. So there is a lot to be unpacked here in terms of mining and geoheritage. I should also point out here that as far as metallic zinc is concerned, we have very interesting evidence from the Zawar mines in the Rajasthan region for some of the earliest smelting and extraction of metallic zinc with furnaces and so on, intact furnaces found. But in this case, these did not match the Zawar mines. But it's very interesting also that I was able to find from technical analysis a 4th century zinc coin ingot with Brahmi, Deccan Brahmi inscriptions from a private collection. And this actually not only matched an early historic votive brass artifact from the Victoria and Albert Museum, but this seems to be an early source of metallic zinc, which did not match the Zawar mine in Rajasthan. So it seems that there was also an early source of zinc and brass in southern India, which we still don't know which it is. And this had 13% zinc and 8% lead and 10% tin. And it's also significant, though, that there is some early evidence for exploitation of ore deposits in the Andhra region, as I pointed out that this brass image was also from the Krishna Delta in the Andhra region. And the Agni Gundala mine in Andhra Pradesh, for which I had studied some of the galena, had lead isotope ratios which matched some Shatavahana silver coins. So this suggests that, of course, that this mines was being exploited and there was early metallurgical activities going back to the Shatavahana period, at least in the Deccan. And it's interesting that, of course, the Deccan is also known for the high zinc alloy of Bidri ware, which was developed under the Deccan Sultanate, which is a alloy with about 90% zinc. And speaking of literacy day and so on, there is also some very fine examples of calligraphy from the Quran and so on in the Deccan Bidri ware. This is, of course, a later piece, but just to point to this tradition. Now, I'll touch upon some case studies which are of interest in terms of the fingerprinting and how we're able to reclassify artifacts. This is a fine image of a Yakshi, which was from the Victoria and Albert Museum. And it wasn't certain whether this was a North Indian piece, for example, Kushan, or whether it's from Southern India. And the technical fingerprints, which included the trace elements and the lead isotope ratios, better fitted the Southern Indian context. And in fact, if you look at it, it does actually stylistically look quite a bit like some of the early historic artifacts from Southern India, such as in this frieze of the early Andhra style, showing the dream of Maya related to the birth of Buddha. And this is, of course, a Yakshi also of the Shatavahana period. And there are also these artifacts of the Indo-Roman period, which shows this kind of stance with the bent knee and so on, such as this Mithuna couple from a gold signet ring. And this is also a potsherd from Arikameru, of the Indo-Roman period and so on. And just to clarify, when we look at that larger group of lead isotope, that larger scatter over there, when I looked at it much closer, what was also interesting is that amongst a larger group of South Indian bronzes, there was some finer grouping between different styles of bronzes, which suggested that they were either different mining areas within a larger mining region, different mines within a larger mining region, or distinct, mines. But this seems to be more the case. It could be that they were different mines within a larger mining region. That could be one explanation. And what is interesting is that the Chola lead isotope ratios were quite distinct, for example, from the Vijayanagara lead isotope ratios, suggesting that different lead sources were being used. And this could also be used for reclassification of some artifacts. Now, this is a sampled and inscribed Kali image of the 10th century for which the lead isotope ratios matched an early Chola attribution. And as you can see, it bears resemblances to this dancing Kali image from Thiruvalangadu in Chengalpet district, dated to 975 CE by Nagaswamy to the Queen Sembian Mahadevi. And you can see here that she's holding a noose and the hair stands up like that. There's a garland of skulls, which is actually replacing the sacred thread in a way. So these are very fascinating similarities over here. And just to point to the image of the Vijayanagara period, a typical example is of Varaha with Bhudevi. Varaha is an avatar of Vishnu with the consort Bhudevi. And this image from the Victoria and Albert Museum had been fingerprinted by my studies to the Vijayanagara group. And you can see the stylistic similarities to this sculpture of Lakshmi Narayana, which is in the Kamalapura Museum. And the Lakshmi is seated in the same way and similar kinds of proportions as well. Now, I'll come to some of the Buddhist bronzes as well. Of course, Nagapattinam was a great source of Buddhist bronzes, and Rajaraja Cholan patronized the setting up of a Buddhist vihara at Nagapattinam, also which was also accessed by the Southeast Asian Srivijayan king from the Malay archipelago. And this very fine image also was fingerprinted to the High Chola period of the seated Buddha with fly whisk bearers and under a parasol and so on. And there is also a dated Lokeshwara image, which is Buddhist, in the Manjunatha temple in Kadri in Karnataka, which also has a 10th century inscription. Of course, I've not sampled it. And this was an interesting example of a gilt Buddha, which is from the 11th and 12th century in the V&A, which was also technically fingerprinted to the late Chola group. And it's also interesting that because there are some confusion also in terms of Nagapattinam bronzes and Sri Lankan bronzes as to which are from Southern India and which could be from Sri Lanka, especially if you're looking at museum collections. And this image, the technical fingerprints very clearly fitted the South Indian group in terms of the trace elements and lead isotope ratios and so on, pointing to a South Indian provenance. And also it had very few traces of iron, whereas I found that some of the Sri Lankan images had more significant traces of iron. And there is, of course, a very significant copper magnetite deposit in Sri Lanka, which may explain the higher traces of iron in the Sri Lankan artifacts compared to South Indian. And the gilding is also an interesting aspect because mercury gilding was used. And when you undertake mercury gilding, then the lead should be a bit low because basically an amalgam of mercury and gold is applied and then it is burnished or heated. And if there is a lot of lead, then the lead will also has a low melting point and it will also start melting out and spoil the casting. So there's deliberately less lead in this. I should also mention that this Lokeshwara image is also gilded, although we, need to actually better document some of the gilt images and so on in various collections. And of course, this Nagapattinam Buddha image also seems to hark back to the style of the Sultanganj Buddha. As you can see, this is a very famous, the largest Indian bronze actually in the Birmingham Museum of the about the 7th century, late Gupta period. But the South Indian image has this very distinct pedestal and the processional holes, showing a similarity in the Buddhist and Hindu traditions of taking the images out in processions as Utsava Murtis. as had been mentioned earlier. Yes. So, and this is a fine example of a Chola Devi, which had also been fingerprinted to the 10th century. And as you can see here, she bears similarities to this beautiful Tandantotam Parvati, which is also of the early 10th century, which is still intact in the temple. And again, I'm not sure this bronze might well be gilded. It needs to be looked at more closely. And you can also see the similarities with a sculpture in the Nageshwara temple in Kumbakonam of the 9th century. Now, to show you the potential of the chemical analysis and so on, now this Parvati from Kudiyakadu had been fingerprinted to the Vijayanagara period. And it is not fitting the Chola trace element and lead isotope ratio analysis, although it had been thought to be Chola by the government museum in Chennai. But when you look at it closely, actually, the design and so on, accoutrements, they are much more similar to this Rama image, which has been fingerprinted to the 15th century Vijayanagara period. And art historians would also agree that this is a Vijayanagara era bronze. So it tells you how we could actually miss something just from visual or stylistic analysis. So the technical analysis gives us additional criteria. And as you can see here, this Rama image also has similarities with the depiction in the Ramachandra temple in Hampi, where Rama is depicted with this long bow. So you see this long bow here as well. And one of the very interesting aspects from my study was in terms of the Pallava bronzes, because although there are the odd inscribed Chola bronzes, there are almost no inscribed Pallava bronzes as such. So since I had included a Pallava seal, a well-dated Pallava seal in the analysis, it was, and some other Pallava coin seals and so on, it was easy to actually establish that there is a Pallava group of bronzes which share similar metallurgical profiles. And this beautiful Somaskanda image, which has 3% lead, was also fingerprinted by me to the Pallava period. This is in the Chennai Museum. And you can see, of course, the
I think we've lost the speaker for a second. We'll just stay online. I'm sure she'll reconnect. Please do stay online. I'll just give her a quick call to see if she can reconnect. So sorry about this. To all our guests, do hold on for just a minute. I'm having Dr. Sharda Srinivasan just reconnect with us. I think we had a small internet glitch on her side. So sorry about this. Do stay online. Please stay online for just a couple more seconds. Professor Sharda Srinivasan is just reconnecting. I think there was a small power outage at her house. It's back on now. Do hold on for just a minute. Thank you. Okay, so the speaker is back on. Do give us a second. She will just go back to her screen sharing and presentation. So thank you for your patience, everyone.
Yeah, so can you hear me? I'm so sorry. I think there was a brief power outage here. But
yes, ma'am, you're back on. So maybe you can just share your screen once more and we'll go back to where you left off on the PPT. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So I think I'd finished explaining about this. So I'll move on to the next one. Yeah. Is that all right? Can you see this?
Yes, we can see it on full screen. Thank you.
Very good. So another very interesting aspect of my study was that although the image of Shiva dancing the Bhujangatrasta Karna, as I explained, with the leg extended, is typically attributed to the Chola period, I was able to identify this image, which is actually from in analysis indicated that it seems to be of the Pallava period. And when you look at it more closely, there are aspects which actually fit the Pallava stylistic, depictions, such as this image of dancing Shiva in the Kailasanatha Swami temple. You see these elaborate Kati Sutra, which is also depicted in metal and such like. And of course, since I know that you're also very much into books, I remember seeing in Charles Allen's book, Coromandel, that he pointed out that the Pallava bronze is actually now from metallurgical analysis attributed to the Pallava and not Chola period. I mean, the dancing Nataraja is attributed to the Pallava period, but he didn't mention that the analyst was me. But anyway, that's nice that it's getting into the popular understanding. But another interesting aspect of my study was also that at the Chidambaram temple, which is devoted to the worship of Shiva Nataraja as the main icon in the sanctum in place of the lingam, there is also a tradition that in the month of Margari, which is the month of December, you see very clearly the constellation of Orion right overhead in the temple. And in fact, there was a depiction in one of the books by Chokkalingam of the early 20th century, which one of the Dikshitar or the priests of Chidambaram, one of the family Raja Dikshitar, had shown me, which connects the star Betelgeuse or Arudra to the Shiva Nataraja. And there is this depiction there of Arudra Tandava Darshanam. And this is something which Ganapati Stapati also spoke about, the late Ganapati Stapati, master stone sculptor of Mahabalipuram. And so it seems that the iconography of Shiva Nataraja had also derived some inspiration from the star positions of Orion, although we don't have much textual evidence. But anyway, I had undertaken a star chart plotting along with the late astrophysicist Nirupama Raghavan, and then I've also further expanded on that work. And as you can see here, the star positions of Orion and the belt of Orion and so on correspond fairly well with the image of Shiva Nataraja, pointing to the inspiration directly from the stars, because often we do talk about the cosmic dance of Shiva, but more in a metaphorical sense of creation and destruction. But here it's possible that there is actually a direct inspiration from the stars. And another interesting aspect is the leg extended towards the star Sirius. And Sirius is also described as Mrigavyada and also linked also to Shiva and so on. And I also tried this on this sculpture from Kanchipuram. And it is interesting also that the constellation Lepus comes somewhere below the Orion constellation. Lepus in Greece, in Greek traditions, is also linked to the hare. And it's interesting that in Tamil, the dwarf demon is also referred to as Muyalagan, and Muyalagan actually also means hare. So there could be some connection here between Indian and Greek depictions of the Orion, and because Orion is also the hunter in Greek traditions. And anyway, this seems to be a very interesting and novel way in which the iconography may have been connected with actual observations of star positions and so on. And this here is also another example of bronze of the Pallava period attributed by some of the early scholars in dancing in Urdhva posture on top of a rather large Muyalagan over here, as you can see here. Though, of course, later he becomes more subdued. And another interesting aspect from the technical analysis is that I did not find any bronzes of Nataraja which could be attributed to the Vijayanagara period. And of course, the Vijayanagara rulers were more staunchly Vaishnava. And this is also an interesting example of where inscriptions can give us some leads, but they could also be misleading in a way. There is a pedestal inscription on this particular image from Belur, which George Michel had also pointed out that the pedestal inscription of 1511 suggests that this is a Vijayanagara bronze and that the Nataraja bronze was also cast in the Vijayanagara period. But my analysis of the main body of the image suggested that it better fitted the later part of the Imperial Chola period. So it seems to be a late Imperial Chola bronze. And this, for example, the Velankani Nataraja, of course, is a high Chola bronze, and it is also accepted as such by art historians. This had 5% lead and 4% tin, and you can see that it fits very well also with the style of Ardavalan Nataraja in the Brihadishwara temple. So, but it seems that this image is actually a rather badly made or provincially made, maybe bronze of the Imperial Chola period, and it is not a Vijayanagara bronze, because usually if a bronze is not so well made, also we tend to think of it of a later bronze, but that's also not necessarily the case. So this provides an interesting example where the pedestal may have been separately cast and then inscribed, and this may have been an earlier piece. Another interesting example is of the very beautiful example of inscribed bronzes is the portrait bronze of the Vijayanagara ruler Krishna Deva Raya and the wives, Chinnamma Devi and Tirumala Devi, which is in the Tirumala temple of 1518. And you can see here the style of Krishna Deva Raya also harks back again to the Chola period. This is a chieftain from South Arcot, which I had fingerprinted to the Chola period of leaded bronze. And you can see that there is also a stone sculpture of a king in the Kamalapura Museum, which has a similar kind of depiction. But what is interesting is that the cap of Krishna Deva Raya is more in the style of the Kulai, which is associated with Deccan traders, Deccan Muslim traders and Persian traders and so on. And it is not like the crown that you associate with for instance, this Rama image, which had been fingerprinted to the Vijayanagara period. And the crown there is more like what you see for deities like in Lepakshi and so on. So there's this distinction being made as the king as the devotee rather than the king in terms of royal kinship. And I've also shown, though, at another level, though, the proportions of Krishna Deva Raya follows more of the Dashatala or the Tala canon, which is associated with major divinities like Vishnu. So there are different nuances. In that sense, there is also a connection with divine kinship. He's not depicted in Ashtatala, which is like an ordinary man. And I also wanted to mention that the sources of metal for the Vijayanagara period could have been Tintini, which is in the northern Karnataka region, because the trace element analysis of the metallurgical debris and slag specimens in the copper prills also matched the nickel cobalt ratio profiles, for instance, of the Vijayanagara bronzes. And here you see some of the ore washing tanks at Tintini, and it is already, you can see the way in the Vijayanagara period, they were using different types of stones and sculpting granite in very masterful ways. And Tintini also has a temple to a metalworking saint known as Moneshwara, and this is one of the inscribed copper slabs over there, and some pestles which were used for ore crushing and so on. And so these are interesting aspects of the ethnography and so on, which we need to look at a bit more. I'll finally also touch upon the interesting case of another very important metalworking tradition, which had also been affected by the Kerala floods, the making of the bronze mirrors in Aranmula. And these have such a good reflective image, almost as good as modern metal images, as you can see. And these are made by a very skilled tradition of optimizing a high tin bronze content of 33% tin, which is a very specular alloy because it optimizes the presence of the delta phase of bronze, which is very silvery and hard, and it can be polished very easily and takes a very high polish. And the technique of casting it was very skillful, so that you got a very thin blank by making it and casting it in a crucible cum mold process, where the metal to be cast was placed here, and the blank with a thin gap left here. And so this is a surviving tradition of great consequence. But what was also interesting in terms of the fingerprinting technique was that I had also been able to analyze this old mirror with the insignia of the Travancore royal family from Kerala. And of course, this has the Gandaberudam type motif, which is also seen in the royal context, such as Mysore. And this has a brass handle. But this here is this microstructure confirms that this is made of pure delta phase, actually silvery white delta phase. Of course, it's tarnished a bit, but in its heyday, it would have had a very brilliant polish. But interestingly, the chemical fingerprints of this delta bronze, the copper source seems to have been the same as the what was being used in the 18th century in the later Nayaka and Tanjavur Maratha period. So this can be fingerprinted to the 18th century, which is also consistent with the style. And this is an early example of such a mirror. And of course, Aranmula also has a beautiful temple. And here you see the processional icon. It is very moving that it is actually being taken on the head of the priest, which shows you that perhaps in antiquity, the archaic custom was actually carrying the processional icon on the head. And later on, the bamboo poles and so on, other paraphernalia, elephants and so on, come in to take the image out in procession. Well, this is my final slide. And I just wanted to mention that although the Chola bronzes are very intensely visualized and conceived with great beauty, and the devotional poetry also speaks of the beauty of the imageries of the Lord and so on, what I find also very fascinating is that there is also an aspect which is in a way beyond vision. And there is this transcendental quality. For instance, there's a lovely verse by Manika Vachakar, translated by Yoakum, which says, "O unique consciousness, Oru Unarvu, which is realized, Unarvathu, as standing firm, transcending words and ordinary consciousness, Unaru. Oh, let me know a way to tell of you." And what's interesting here is that the word Unarvu is used a lot as consciousness. It's a Tamil word. And we know that the Chidambaram temple, the term Chidambaram itself resolves as Chit and Ambaram, which is consciousness and cosmos. So in a way, bringing together this notion of the cosmic consciousness. And of course, Shiva is also worshipped there as the Akasha Lingam or ether. But this is already there in the Tamil tradition, preceding the later Sanskritic, overlayings and things like that. And this verses of Manika Vachakar also point to that. And there's another very beautiful verse which says, "Ah, when will I get to gaze upon the unique one to whom no other compares? Him who is fire, water, wind, earth, and ether, him whom others cannot understand." And again, evoking very beautifully these cosmic aspects of fire, water, wind, ether, and earth, and the combination, which also points to the majesty of this tradition, where in an era preceding the Renaissance, the poetry and the devotional aspects and the art of sculpting and the scientific dimensions in a way all come together and uniquely sort of connect the human with the cosmic. And whether you call it the divine or not is, of course, up to you. But the connection between the human and cosmic, I think, is a very beautiful one and a very contemporary idea as well. So thank you very much. With that, I will conclude. And I think I will stop my screen share, or should I?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
I think you can close the screen share for now.
Yeah,
It'll be great to have you on the full screen.
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you for that very intense, but extremely different and educational talk. We've had a lot of talks by, scholars like you on art, but this is the first time we're actually delving a little deeper into what is inside or, what is under all those layers of beauty that we actually see in sculptural forms, especially with metal pieces. So we have just a quick update for everyone. The Q&A box is now ready to take your questions, and I think we have a couple of them flowing in. So the first one comes in from Mr. Vipul Mathur, who says most of the references today were from the south and west of India. How was the use of metal in the North Indian sculptures?
Yeah. So in the North Indian examples, well, that's a whole topic in itself. And sometimes you can only look at some aspects in more depth. But North Indian sculptures, actually, as I mentioned, Zawar was an important source of zinc and brass. And it seems quite interesting. There have been studies made by Chandra Reedy, for example. And so there was actually a fair bit of use of brass also in Northern India. And that is a significant aspect. Another interesting aspect, I didn't have time to go through it here because there was only so much I could cover, is that the South Indian tradition actually used the solid casting process more, where the wax model is actually solid. And so eventually you get a solid metal artifact. But quite often in the North, I think that also harks back to the Hellenistic tradition. Quite often in the North Indian bronzes, the core is of clay, and then there is a thin layer of wax added onto it. So when you make the mold and melt it out and pour the metal in, there's a thin layer which is there of the metal. That was a very common Hellenistic tradition. And the Sultanganj Buddha, which again harks back to the Northwestern Indian traditions and the Hellenistic influence and so on, that is actually a hollow casting. It is not a solid casting. So these were some of the differences.
So were these different techniques of casting region specific for particular reasons?
It could be, because I won't say region specific in that sense. It probably depends on, in this case, there seem to have been these differences where it could also depend on the ritual associations.
Okay.
And perhaps it may also do with the fact that many of the Buddhist bronzes that we're talking about in the North, of course, the Buddhist tradition may have had some preferences, but I think it is more region specific, because all the bronzes of South India, whether they are Jain or Buddhist or Hindu, they tend to follow this preference for the main image being solid cast. And it may also deal with, for instance, if you talk to the Sthapatis, they will tell you it's because it is considered more auspicious, and it's not auspicious to have a hollow image. So it could be these regional differences which developed over time. And so on.
But it's interesting that, in a country that is so vast and varied, you have such clear and significant differences in the way art was even structured.
Yes, and I think it also depended on the access to metals and resources, because in this case, in Northern India, there was quite easy access to zinc and brass, which was perhaps in the South Indian cases, more of a preference for bronze, not so much. Of course, there are some brasses and things like that.
So we have another question that's come in from Prithvi Prabhu. His question is regarding the Bhakti Vigraha. Were they installed in all the temples built by the Maharajas or Maharani, or was there a distinguishing factor?
So, well, of course, I think one problem is also we need much more of documentation of the images which are in the temples. And of course, several scholars have done it, but there needs to be much more. But I think, of course, the difference in the sense that the Shaivite temples have the images of the Nayanmar, the Shaivite saints, such as Appar and Sundarar and so on. And the Vaishnava temples, of course, have the images of the Alvar, who are the Vaishnavite saints, like Thirumangai Alvar and Andal in Srivilliputtur and so on. So yes, it was also, of course, the affiliations and so on also mattered in terms of which kinds of images of saints were to be found in which temples.
Nandan Shastri asks, have you done analysis on some metal art objects with filigree work?
I would love to. As I said, my main problem is A, resources, and B, access to material. So, but I did, of course, when you talk about filigree, it is quite common in silver and so on, and in gold, because those can be, they are much more ductile, and so filigree can be done. I have seen some copper filigree artifacts that I saw actually from Kerala and such like, but I've not had the chance to get my hands on some. I would love to, of course.
Okay. Krishnamurthy S has a question. He asks, is it possible to date a metal image only using chemical analysis without the help of iconography or inscriptions?
Well, I would say that, it would be a little I think it's better to be cautious and because you see, the thing is, it also depends. I mean, I won't say things can go wrong in the analysis, but for instance, if there were to be, sometimes they can be in your standard, you can use a COBOL standard and things like that. And if, for instance, if you have somebody who's not a very well-trained analyst, he may think that COBOL spike actually relates to the bronze and things like that. So first, your analysis technique has to be very good and so on. And the other thing is that you need to actually kind of look at and in this case, for instance, if you just had a scientist doing it, he probably wouldn't know whether there was cobalt in antiquity or not. He would just give it to you. But I would know as an archaeologist that I don't expect to see, like 20% cobalt or something, just saying, for example, in a bronze, because it would not be found in an archaeological context. So I could say that there is something wrong, either it's a later piece or something like that. Because in that sense, you need to have an archaeometallurgical training to understand what sort of alloys and trends and trace elements and all that you can actually find. And the other thing is that where I feel that you do need to look at the art historical and inscriptional evidence and so on, because I think they should be used to corroborate each other. The other thing, because even technical analysis, it has to be done with a lot of nuance. It's not like there's a surefire thing, oh, I just do an analysis, I get an answer. First of all, it takes a lot of time to get your analysis done because, because with these archaeological objects, you get very, very fine samples. You have to make sure, very small samples and things like that with micro drilling. And the other thing is that with the analysis, the important thing is also that you need to be sure that, for instance, what could happen is that, with the lead isotope analysis, what could happen is that you could have lead from two different sources which are mixed in the artifact, or that image itself could be recycled later as that, for instance, that particular image, once it's been cast, it could be recycled in a later period, but it would still have the same lead isotope ratio. So there it would be significant to actually look at the style of the image and say, okay, does this fit a later style or an earlier style? So I think a lot of these things need to work in conjunction. But so where many parameters sort of come together, then I would say that there is more chance of it working.
Okay. So we have another question that has just popped in from Bandara Vijaypala. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. The person says, I have read many of your archaeological reports and articles, and this is a slightly different kind of reading. Thank you very much to the organizers. Okay, so it's an appreciation message from Sri Lanka.
Oh, very nice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you one very layperson question. Now, to many of us who do work or who do some sort of study in the art world, we are very, very uninformed about the kind of work that you do. So when you do actually take a sample from a Chola bronze or, a old artifact, what kind of a sample do you actually collect?
Yeah, so you see, there are different techniques, and it depends on how well you're able to access or sample them, of course. Because sometimes, there are some people who insist that, no, it has to be completely non-destructive. They don't want anything done to it. And that, of course, limits your choices to some extent, because then you can do, for instance, XRF analysis, which is non-destructive. But XRF is a surface analysis. So you can get a surface analysis, which is useful in some cases. But then these artifacts also maybe sometimes corroded and things like that. So, but it is what we call a semi-quantitative, result. But the more let's say sensitive techniques are, what I attempted, for instance, you can do micro drilling to get very small amounts. It's no more than about, 5 to 10 or even 20 milligrams, maximum 50 milligrams, we're lucky. And then you, of course, put it into solution, and then you can do inductively coupled plasma optical emission spectroscopy. These days, there's also laser ablation, which uses a very small amount. And there's also laser ablation mass spectrometry for lead isotope ratios, though I think the thermal ionization method, which dissolves the sample, is much more sensitive, and that's what I did, and that's what I think we prefer. And these are expensive techniques, but so that's where I think we need to have the will and, to have support for these kind of areas, which tend to be very much niche activities. And of course, I do also face the problems where, as you said, you may have not heard of this kind of work in the art world, but sometimes when it's interdisciplinary like this, the art historians don't take it totally seriously because they say this is not come via inscriptions and so on. So how can you believe something's from metallurgical analysis? And the scientists sort of see you as being somewhere in between. You're not quite a scientist. So we're sort of falling between these stools. So it's very nice when you have fora like yours, which, take interest in.
But it's great to actually hear from you and understand that there is so much of science and so much of technicality to every aspect of art that, we as a country that is so rich in heritage are so proud to hold. So I think we're done with most of the questions that have come into us. I will ask Gitanjali to please come back on screen to say, thank you for this very interesting session today.
Thank you, Archana. I think just let me know, because I think I have as well a little unstable internet connection. So
you're good for now. Please proceed.
Okay. I think there is a question which I'm going to bring back, or it's a comment. It's thank you to Professor Srinivasan. What a wealth of information. Would be great if the recording of the session is to be made available, and we look forward to such webinars from you. So I think that I wanted to read out specifically, because I think even between Facebook, and I'll share the comments with you privately, I think that's the kind of comments everybody came. It's tough to ask questions when it's so in depth. And thank you for your knowledge, and thank you for sharing it. And all I can say is I'm wowed. I came in, expecting so little, and I just wanted to hear it for the first time. And that truly has happened. So thank you very much for today's session. I'd like to thank T.S. Prasad for the foundation for recommending this. I think it was a brilliant suggestion, Prasad. I know you're on the webinar, so here's my thanks. Archana, thank you for doing it, and to all the people at SGMF, thank you. Sharda ji, thank you once again. I had a chance to hear you 2 years ago at the BIC, and
Yes.
this is the next time I'm hearing you. So thank you for coming on board SGMF.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful opportunity, and wonderful questions and discussions, and look forward to keeping in touch. And congratulations again on all your enlightenment activities. Thank you.
Thank you. And just for everyone who's here, should you like to listen to the talk once more, please go to our website, www.sgmf.co.in. The talk will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. You can access it through our website. If you like to listen to the talk once more, please go to our website, www.sgmf.co.in. The talk will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. You can access it through our website. Thank you, and good evening to everyone. We're done for today.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank
Sharda.
you. Bye. Good night. Have a good day.
I hope we meet soon.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.